Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe through something deeply odd: soft soil, shadowy gardens, and a root that's not only shaped like a human, it supposedly screams when you dig it up. A plant that shrieks so loudly, it kills you. Medieval folks didn't just believe it, they built entire rituals around it. If you weren't careful, you probably wouldn't survive this garden trip. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're watching from. Bonus points if you're watching somewhere slightly spooky. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking now, just past midnight, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The stars are sharp, and the air smells like cold iron and herbs. A garden stretches around you, more like an overgrown apothecary, really. You can barely see through the fog. And right there, nestled near the edge of the hedge maze, is what you came for: a mandrake root. It doesn't look like much at first, just leaves and a tangled snarl of vines. But dig a little, and there it is. A thick, pale root twisted into the shape of a tiny, clenched human. It almost looks like it has a face. Cute? Not quite. It's unsettling, like a toddler statue left out in the rain for too long. People used to swear they heard it breathing underground. And here's the thing, you're not supposed to pull it out with your hands. Not unless you're tired of living. According to medieval lore, when a mandrake root is yanked from the earth, it lets out a piercing scream. Not a squeal. Not a whimper. A full-blown, eardrum-shattering, soul-ripping shriek that kills anyone who hears it. So, sleep tight. The belief was so serious, people came up with all sorts of methods to harvest the root safely. More on that later. But for now, you stare at it and wonder how a plant got this creepy. The answer, of course, starts way before the Middle Ages. Back in the ancient Mediterranean, people were already getting weird about plants. The mandrake, or mandragora, was one of the earliest psychoactive herbs recorded in medical texts. Ancient Egyptians knew about it. So did the Greeks and Romans. Hippocrates mentioned it, though he preferred it soaked in wine. Of course he did. They didn't think it screamed back then, but they did think it was powerful. It could supposedly cure insomnia, numb pain, and make you, let's just say, romantically adventurous. A medieval herbalist would call that stimulating the humors. You might call it taking medieval Viagra with a side of hallucinations. Historians still argue whether the screaming part was a homegrown medieval invention or if it has older roots, pun intended. Some say the myth bloomed in early Islamic texts that describe the mandrake as moaning during harvest. Others trace it to Northern Europe, where it merged with local folk tales about earth spirits and graveyard plants. Either way, by the time the story settled into medieval consciousness, the mandrake had become a full-blown character. Not just a root. A dangerous, sentient little gremlin hiding in the dirt. And as you stand here, in this imaginary garden that smells like crushed thyme and wet stone, you realize people feared this plant like a cursed object. Mandrakes weren't just odd, they were believed to have souls. Some believed they only grew beneath gallows, springing from the final fluids of executed men. The mandrake was thought to drink in that death, absorb it, and then nestle into the earth like a fetal ghost. Cheery bedtime stuff. But it didn't end there. In popular imagination, the mandrake root wanted to be found, but only by those worthy, which, of course, was no one. So if you got too close and tried to pluck it yourself, it would punish you for your arrogance. Death by scream. Others claimed you'd go mad instead. Your brain would melt, your eyes would cross, and you'd wander the woods babbling about singing roots for the rest of your very short life. So, obviously, someone came up with a workaround. It involved a dog. You'll get to meet him soon. But right now, you crouch there in the mist. Just you, the soil, and the eerie silence around the mandrake. Maybe it's breathing. Maybe that's your own breath fogging in the night. The leaves rustle just slightly. You lean closer. No scream. Not yet. The mandrake is patient. There's a reason these roots were kept in velvet-lined boxes, passed down through families, and hidden away during church visits. People believed mandrakes brought protection, or wealth, or a curse if you ticked them off. They were carved into little human figures, dressed in tiny robes, and fed offerings like milk, blood, or bread. One French noble reportedly kept his mandrake in a cradle and hired a wet nurse to rock it nightly. Not creepy at all. Whether you believed or not, one thing was clear: no other plant had quite this reputation. And in a world full of plague, superstition, and moonlit secrets, the mandrake felt dangerously alive. The ground is cold under your knees now, and the fog is starting to thicken. You can almost hear something, a hum? A whisper? Maybe your ears are just playing tricks on you. Or maybe the mandrake knows you're here. Either way, you're not leaving without the root. But you're definitely not pulling it out barehanded. Unless, of course, you enjoy spontaneous death by botany. You don't pull the mandrake. Not yet. Instead, you sit back on your heels, eyes flicking to the horizon, where fog smudges the treetops into sleepier shadows. There's no rush. This root has been here for decades, maybe longer. It can wait, and you've got time to unroll the whole tangled mess of its origins, like ancient scrolls that smell faintly of wormwood and regret. So let's go back, way back, to the era when most medicine involved wine, incense, and the occasional bird liver. The mandrake first shows up in written history over 3,000 years ago, in a place that didn't call itself anything close to medieval. Ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians had a vague idea that certain plants were different. Some made you sleep, some made you dream, some made you think your neighbor's cat was your reincarnated grandfather. The mandrake fell into this last group. It was small and squat, with dark green leaves and purple flowers, kind of like a brooding eggplant that had joined a cult. The root often split into 2 or more branches, and when pulled up, if you were brave or dumb enough, it looked unnervingly like a baby. A little root child with limbs, torso, and a baldish bulb for a head. No wonder people thought it had feelings. But if ancient Greeks believed the mandrake was sacred to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, which feels slightly insulting to Aphrodite, but okay. They used it in love potions and as an aphrodisiac. One physician, Dioscorides, who basically invented the phrase, "Take 2 and call me in the morning," recommended mandrake juice to treat depression, inflammation, and excessive lust. You know, just in case you were suffering from all 3 at once. This is your mainstream historical fact. Ancient medical texts from around 100 CE describe the use of mandrake in surgical anesthesia. That's right. Before modern anesthetics, Greek and Roman doctors sometimes gave their patients mandrake wine to knock them out before cutting into flesh. Nothing like mixing major surgery with a psychotropic root wine and blind optimism. But the effects weren't consistent. Sometimes it just made patients drowsy. Other times, it made them hallucinate wildly mid-procedure. Picture screaming, "The moon is full of bees," while your leg is being amputated with a bronze saw. We've come a long way. The Romans also thought mandrake was magical. Pliny the Elder, Rome's favorite overachiever/naturalist, wrote that it should only be harvested while drawing 3 magic circles around the plant. Also, you had to face west. Also, offer a prayer. Also, don't sneeze. Basically, harvesting a mandrake was a full religious ceremony with a side of panic attack. Historians still argue whether the Greeks or Romans ever truly believed the root screamed, or if that part evolved later, like a rumor on medieval TikTok. But there are hints. Early Jewish folklore from the Talmud mentions mandrakes bringing fertility, dreams, and even jealousy. Remember the story of Rachel and Leah fighting over mandrakes in the Bible? Ancient roots, ancient drama. And in Arabic texts during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like Avicenna described the mandrake's narcotic qualities. But they were also cautious. One wrong dose, and you'd go from mildly drowsy to permanently horizontal. You glance back at the garden around you, soil damp and still. The mandrake hasn't screamed yet. You haven't pulled it. Also good. The myth really blossoms in medieval Europe. That's when things get properly weird. Superstitions, fear of witchcraft, and the complete lack of daytime television left people with plenty of time to obsess over roots. Some thought mandrakes grew beneath gallows, born from the tears or bodily fluids of the condemned. Imagine being executed and your final legacy is a creepy little root baby that moans at moonlight. Others believed mandrakes could walk. Not far and not fast, but just enough to shuffle around a cottage at night like a nosy toddler. They were said to whisper secrets to their owners. Sometimes blessings, sometimes warnings, sometimes absolute nonsense, which was still better than most town criers. In a 13th century folk remedy, if you were cursed, you were told to sleep with a mandrake under your pillow, but only after bathing it in goat milk and reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. Try explaining that to your sleep paralysis demon. But why did people believe this? You'd think someone might have said, hey, this is clearly a root, not a demon fetus. But that's the thing. People didn't have microscopes or snarky fact-checkers. If a plant looked vaguely human, it must be humanish. If it helped you sleep, it must be magical. And if it screamed when pulled, well, who is going to risk proving it wrong? You sit there now, remembering all this, as your fingers gently brush the dirt. The mandrake is cold, almost clammy. It smells like bitter earth and mint, which feels suspiciously medicinal. A thought creeps in, did the plant want to be found? Medieval folks would have said yes. They believed mandrakes called out to certain people. Not everyone, just those who were lonely enough, desperate enough, or slightly unhinged enough to hear it. You may be. The night deepens around you. Somewhere nearby, an owl coughs once and decides not to get involved. Your knees ache. Still you wait. The root lies coiled like a secret, daring you to tug. But you won't. Not yet. You're smarter than that. You know the rules. First, you'll need a rope. Then a dog. Then something to plug your ears. Because if the root screams and you're still listening, let's just say you won't be tuning in for tomorrow night's episode. You gather the rope like a medieval herbalist preparing for the world's worst magic trick. It's scratchy hemp, probably borrowed from some half-suspect cart in the village. Definitely not OSHA-approved. But this is how it's done. This is the way. You tie one end gently around the base of the mandrake, careful not to bruise the root. Wouldn't want to hurt its feelings, obviously. The other end? Well, that gets tied to a dog. Yes, a dog. Preferably a black one, preferably stray, and preferably one with no known family or emotional attachments. Because, according to the lore, the only way to safely harvest a mandrake is to let a dog do it. And then, well, not ask about the dog afterward. The logic? When you pull the root, it screams. A deadly, supernatural, soul-splitting scream that kills whoever hears it. But if a dog pulls it, you stand at a safe distance, plug your ears with wax or wool, and wait for the dog to keel over. No scream-induced death for you. Just mild guilt and a very dramatic Tuesday. Historians still argue whether anyone actually did this or if it was just widely repeated nonsense whispered over ale and plague stories. But there are written manuals from the 12th and 13th centuries that describe this exact ritual. With diagrams. Detailed diagrams. Someone really sat down and drew a dog tied to a root and thought, yes, this is serious medicine. One such manual? The Herbarium Apuleae Platonici, a blend of pagan remedies and monkish musings, described this exact process with zero irony. The dog, it says, must be a certain black dog which is hungry. Because apparently mandrake screams are fatal and they pair best with canine hunger. You imagine it now. A tiny root buried beneath a worn hanging tree, the haggard hound sniffing around nervously, maybe pausing to chase a beetle. You, standing at a ridiculous distance like a medieval Scooby-Doo villain, ears stuffed with beeswax, holding your breath. Is the root going to scream? Are you going to die? Is the dog going to do a good job, or get distracted halfway through and run after a squirrel? This was medicine back then. And yet, people wanted mandrakes. Badly. Not just for sleeping potions or love charms. Mandrakes were status symbols. Owning one meant you had power, money, or access to shady apothecaries behind castle walls. Some even believed a properly tamed mandrake root could bring you wealth. You were supposed to bathe it, clothe it in velvet, feed it milk and honey, and keep it in a tiny bed. Basically, you adopted it like a Victorian doll with supernatural Wi-Fi. Actual mandrake roots were sold on the black market throughout Europe, especially in Germany and France, for obscene amounts of money. We're talking 16th century versions of Etsy listings, where some were even carved to look more human, little wooden arms added, fake eyes painted on. A whole cottage industry grew around customizing mandrakes like terrifying root action figures. The psychology was powerful. A person desperate for a child or a cure or a quick fortune might convince themselves this shriveled, humanoid carrot was the answer. And no one wants to argue with their last hope. In Eastern European folklore, mandrakes could only be picked during very specific cosmic alignments, like full moons during eclipses in months without the letter R. And if you pulled one outside of that, well, legend said the root would curse your household. Fires would start, milk would spoil, children would speak in riddles. You'd stub your toe every morning for a year. You know, classic botanical revenge. People took it seriously enough that even witch hunters and inquisitors had opinions on mandrakes. Some claimed witches used mandrake roots to fly, not on broomsticks, but through potions brewed from its shaved flesh. Others warned that mandrakes were demonic familiars in disguise. You'd be shocked how many people in the 15th century could look at a dirty plant root and immediately scream, "Satan." You shuffle your feet now, watching the rope twitch slightly in the dirt. No dog yet, but you imagine one trotting toward you. Mangy, a little confused, tongue lolling. What kind of day is he having, you wonder? Has he pulled other cursed roots? Is this just another Tuesday in his weird little dog life? Historians still argue whether these elaborate harvest rituals were ever really practiced by common folk or whether they were mostly elite folklore passed down by bored monks, gossipy physicians, and the kind of people who owned leeches in bulk. There's little physical evidence, no preserved ceremonial ropes, no taxidermy dog heroes, but the tales are persistent, which says something about belief. Maybe it's not the scream that's real. Maybe it's the fear of what might happen if you believe in the scream that makes it real. You stroke the rope with your thumb, watching the horizon. Night deepens. Fog settles like powdered velvet over the roots of every plant, not just the cursed ones. In the distance, the bell of a monastery rings softly, probably calling monks to early prayers or very late regrets. The mandrake is still, quiet, innocent. It doesn't look like it wants to kill anyone. But neither did that goose at the village pond, and it definitely had murder in its heart. You grin. That's the thing with history. The line between magical and mildly unhinged is thinner than you'd expect. Just one root away from complete absurdity. So maybe tonight you won't pull it. Maybe you'll leave the dog out of this. Just sit and watch. Let the past unfurl like smoke. You're in no hurry. The root has been here 1,000 years. It's patient. And you? You've got all night. The fog thickens until it clings to your eyelashes, smearing the moonlight into a soft blur. You blink slowly, your breath warming the air in front of you, and the rope in your hand feels like it's grown heavier, not with weight, but with tension, the kind that only exists in long-forgotten stories and half-remembered dreams. You glance down at the root again. The mandrake lies nestled in the earth, just visible where the soil thins, its strange forked shape hinting at arms and legs, curled up like a sleeping doll that's seen too much. You squint. Did it move? Just your imagination, you tell yourself. Probably. See, back in medieval Europe, this wasn't just a plant. The mandrake had a whole resume. Healer, harbinger, spirit, curse dispenser. It was thought to contain the very breath of life, the animating force that made humans human. And why not? Its humanoid shape made it feel like a vegetable doppelganger, something too close to us to be entirely safe. Which brings you to one of the most baffling obsessions of the time, the idea that mandrakes were born from human fluids spilled at the foot of the gallows. You heard that right. The lore went that when a man was hanged, especially an unrepentant sinner, his soul might leak a little. Semen, blood, essence, whatever medieval euphemism you want. That life stuff would drip into the earth beneath the noose and poof, up would grow a mandrake, nourished by death, full of wild, untamed vitality. Think about that next time you eat root vegetables. This belief gave mandrakes a dark kind of holiness. They weren't just plants. They were born of death, soaked in tragedy, infused with the stolen spark of someone who didn't make it through the execution. And in a time when death was more familiar than soap, that meant something. Gallows were often seen not just as places of punishment, but as sites of supernatural energy. People would gather the earth beneath the scaffold to use in spells. Execution ropes were sold as talismans. You could buy the hand of a hanged man. Yes, an actual mummified hand, and use it to find treasure. So planting lore around that setting? Not a stretch at all. But the Mandrake myth takes it a step further. Some accounts from the 14th century describe local, witch midwives, who would camp out under the gallows, waiting for the earth to absorb enough essence to birth a new root. They'd bring candles, chants, and in at least one story from Bohemia, a dead chicken to barter with the underworld. Honestly, your Saturday nights could never compete. In Jewish folklore, specifically in Sefer Harazim and some Kabbalistic texts, there's a creature called the golem, a humanoid form animated from inanimate matter, often soil or clay. The similarities aren't lost on scholars. Some believe the Mandrake may have symbolically functioned like a tiny botanical golem, an echo of life, fashioned from the earth, made to serve or protect, only with less smashing and more screaming. Now, historians still argue whether these rituals, especially the gallows connection, were ever taken seriously or were simply dark metaphors for fertility and punishment. Maybe the stories were symbolic warnings. Or maybe they were just the kind of rumors you whisper to your neighbor when your leeks aren't growing and someone needs to be blamed. But when you stare at the Mandrake root now, its little nubs of shoulders, half buried, it's not hard to see why people thought it held a spark of something more. There's a strange intimacy in its shape. It doesn't look harvested, it looks buried. Like a person. Like a memory. So how do you treat it? Do you dig it up with care? With fear? With reverence? There's no instruction manual that covers this part. No medieval pamphlet titled, "So You Found a Screaming Root," although that would make a fantastic bedtime story for cursed children. But if you do decide to unearth it, tradition says you must prepare. Not just physically, but mentally. Purify yourself. Fast for a day. Whisper a prayer or 7. Or, if you're from certain Italian folk traditions, burn 3 strands of your own hair and spit over your left shoulder. You know, just to be sure. And you're starting to realize something. This root, screaming or not, was never really about medicine. It was about mystery. About touching the edge of the world you can't explain. About taking a thing that looks almost human, born in a place of death, and convincing yourself it could fix everything wrong in your life. You sit back now, hands in the grass, watching the stars appear like pinholes punched through black velvet. The Mandrake is quiet. Maybe it's sleeping. Maybe it's waiting. Or maybe it's just a root, and the real magic lives in you, sitting there believing, even a little bit, that the old stories were true. And hey, while we're being weirdly poetic, here's a question no one's ever answered. If the Mandrake screams when it's pulled from the earth, is it screaming in pain? Or is it screaming in joy? Because imagine being underground for centuries, soaking up gossip from roots and worms, listening to secrets whispered through the soil, and then, finally, boom, you're yanked into the air, light blasting your face like a medieval Beyoncé spotlight. I'd probably scream too. You brush some dirt from your boot. The rope rests beside you now, limp and slack. No dog. No drama. But your fingers itch with curiosity. How deep do the roots go? You shift your weight, the soil crunching softly beneath you, and your fingertips graze the cool, gritty edge of the root once more. Still there. Still stubborn. The ground hums faintly, not with sound, but with that ancient, damp silence that seeps into the bones of old places. You can almost feel the breath of the earth underneath, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. You lean in close, cheek brushing the grass, and listen. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind through leaves, and the internal monologue that's slowly realizing medieval people might have been a little too imaginative, but not entirely off their rockers. Because when they said the Mandrake screamed, they meant it. Not symbolically. Not metaphorically. No, they believed, genuinely and without irony, that this little freak of flora could shriek like a banshee when torn from its earthy bed. Loud enough to kill. Piercing enough to rupture a man's sanity. a howling echo of its forced separation from the underworld or, depending on who you asked, its mother's womb. You weren't just harvesting a root. You were kidnapping a soul. And this wasn't fringe gossip whispered in candlelit corners. This was in manuscripts, herbals, textbooks, the real ones, illuminated, illustrated, and passed around like sacred knowledge. Some of the best-known examples, like the Tequinum Sanitatis, depicted careful, terrified figures digging up mandrakes using the medieval life hack. Tie it to a dog. Remember that? Tie the root to your pup, walk away, call its name, and boom. It yanks the plant loose, dies horribly, sorry Fido, and you, now safely out of scream range, claim your deadly prize. Congratulations! You've traumatized your household and harvested a root you're probably too afraid to use. Welcome to 14th century wellness. That whole, it screams and kills, idea? It was taken seriously enough that respected physicians like Dioscorides and later herbalists like John Gerard mentioned the need for caution when harvesting mandrakes. And Gerard, bless his overly practical soul, even tried to debunk it, writing that he dug one up himself without incident and heard no such terrible noise. But who knows? Maybe he just had noise-canceling earbuds. There's a thread of performance to all this, you notice. Like people wanted the story to be real. Maybe it gave them a sense of control over the unpredictable. Life back then wasn't exactly cozy. Plague, famine, religious anxiety, seasonal allergies with no antihistamines. It makes sense that a plant imbued with such drama would become a talisman. A little piece of horror you could hold in your pocket. There's an old French folk belief that the mandrake scream could only be survived if you plugged your ears with wax and recited the Lord's Prayer backward. Backward? In Latin. While hopping on one foot. Okay, maybe not that last part. But really, who decided the key to survival was a reverse holy incantation? Medieval people were doing mental gymnastics so intense they'd probably qualify for the spiritual Olympics. But then again, scholars today still argue whether the screaming mandrake myth was rooted in actual ritual, theatrical flair, or misunderstood animal behavior. Some think the shriek could have been inspired by the cries of startled animals, foxes, owls, maybe even dogs, coincidentally heard during a nighttime harvest. Others suggest it was metaphor, that the scream was emotional, not auditory, a symbol for the cost of uprooting something sacred. Still others wonder if the whole thing was satire, a clever warning wrapped in absurdity. Don't mess with what you don't understand. Like trying to download cursed software in a medieval forest. You could, but should you? So, you kneel now, rope still limp in your hands, and imagine what it must have felt like to believe this, to truly believe that tugging on this root could bring your final moment. Would your hands shake? Would you leave a note? Would you whisper a goodbye to the tree nearby, just in case it had been listening all these years? And it's not just the fear of the scream. It's what came after. Because once you had a mandrake, assuming you survived, you didn't just throw it in a stew and hope for the best. No, there were rules. You bathed it in wine. You dressed it in tiny clothes. Yes, really. You wrapped it in silk, gave it a little bed, and offered it food once a week like some kind of shriveled, botanical Tamagotchi. Fail to do so, and it might curse you. It's easy to laugh at now, until you remember how people in the 21st century sleep with healing crystals under their pillows, read horoscopes religiously, and talk to houseplants like their roommates. Maybe we're not so different. Maybe the mandrake didn't scream out loud. Maybe it just made people feel seen. Or maybe the scream was never about sound at all. Maybe it was the plant's way of saying, you're pulling at something that shouldn't be pulled. And isn't that what all legends are? Warnings dressed up as bedtime stories? Strange little fables that whisper, tread carefully, friend. This world holds more than you understand. You sit back, grass cool beneath your palms, and watch the breeze stir the rope. The root waits, patient, silent, still mysterious. And maybe that's enough for now. You don't pull the root. Not yet. You let your hand rest beside it, fingers brushing the damp earth like you're comforting something anxious. Or maybe you're the anxious one. Either way, the mandrake stays put, coiled like a question no one wants answered. Because owning a mandrake wasn't just about medicine or magic. It was power, symbolic and otherwise. And you, yes, even you, curled up right now half asleep in your blanket fort of pillows, would have been tempted to keep one. Once the screaming was survived, or avoided with dog-assisted demolition, the mandrake wasn't discarded like your average beet or sprig of thyme. It was treated like a living relic. This wasn't a root, this was a being. A little humanoid charm with the power to change your fortunes. Quite literally. In some parts of medieval Europe, mandrakes were believed to bring wealth. Like actual money. If you kept one in your home, properly tended and regularly fed, don't forget its tiny supper, it could make money appear in your purse overnight. A botanical ATM. No fees, but also no instructions, warranties, or customer support. Of course, as with most too-good-to-be-true miracles, there was a catch. You couldn't just find one and expect it to work. According to some sources, you had to buy a mandrake from someone who hadn't used it yet. You couldn't steal it. You couldn't dig it up and claim it. It had to be willingly passed to you, usually at a cost so high it made you wonder why the seller was parting with it in the first place. Like, if this root makes money rain down from the ceiling, why are you selling it? Mainstream historians confirm that this belief in mandrake as luck charm was widespread enough that fake mandrakes became a cottage industry in Renaissance Europe. Artisans would carve roots into human-like figures, then boil them in milk, stuff them with resin, and roll them in ashes to give them an ancient, mysterious look. Sometimes they'd even stitch on hair. Imagine that, sewing a wig onto a potato-shaped root to con someone out of their life savings. And people bought it. Literally. But here's the thing. Not all mandrakes were friendly. Or rather, not all uses of mandrakes were gentle. Some grimoires suggested that a mandrake could be used to summon spirits, confuse enemies, or render someone invisible, temporarily, of course. It was the Swiss Army knife of the dark arts, tucked in a velvet pouch. If you slipped a mandrake under your lover's pillow, they'd dream only of you. Forever. Think of it as medieval aromatherapy crossed with light stalking. Romantic, if you're into that sort of thing. Yet for all its magical associations, scholars still argue whether the mandrake was actually used regularly in spells, or whether its fame outweighed its practical function. Some say it was too rare and too expensive to be common. Others believe its danger was exaggerated precisely to prevent people from using it frivolously, like those "do not eat" labels on silica packets. You can, but you really shouldn't. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the mandrake had a slightly more clinical reputation. Muslim physicians and herbalists cataloged it as a powerful sedative and anesthetic, often used during surgery. Yes, actual medical surgery. You'd think they'd prefer something less shriek-prone, but apparently the effects were worth the risk. Avicenna himself, big name, kind of the Beyoncé of 11th century medicine, described the mandrake in his Canon of Medicine. It wasn't just magic. It was medicine, if used correctly. Used incorrectly? You don't wake up. That duality, the helpful and the horrific, only deepened the plant's legend. To hold a mandrake was to hold possibility. Wealth or ruin, healing or haunting, sleep or death. Like a nature-made version of Russian roulette, if your revolver had roots and smelled vaguely like moss. And people were so drawn to that danger. You start to understand why now. In a world with few guarantees and plenty of fear, the idea that one wrinkly root could change your destiny was just too good to ignore. It was hope in root form, organic and ominous. You glance again at the rope, now looped loosely around the base of the plant. The dog's gone, probably smarter than you. But part of you wonders, what if it really does scream? What if the legends are echoes of something real, something you can't measure with logic or science? Because here's another wrinkle. Some folks believed mandrakes weren't naturally occurring at all. They were born from human remains. Specifically, the bodily fluids of hanged men. We'll keep this PG, but let's just say it wasn't their tears. The idea was that the ground beneath gallows soaked up the essence of the executed, and from that unholy mix, mandrakes sprouted like botanical phoenixes of tragedy. Which is a choice. A very specific and honestly kind of emo origin story for a plant. You can almost hear the medieval bard writing a mandrake's tragic backstory in iambic pentameter. And yet, even today, the mandrake retains a kind of haunted glamour. You see it in movies, video games, even wellness memes. It has that vibe, mystical, misunderstood, and oddly aesthetic. There's something deeply human about it. Twisted and tangled, partly real and partly dreamed. So you don't pull it. Not because you're afraid of the scream, but because maybe, just maybe, you want to keep believing it might scream. That it could. And there, lying beside the unmoving root, the breeze stroking your cheek, you drift a little deeper into the sleep space between fact and folklore, where history hums and imagination takes the wheel. You wake up, not from sleep, but from the hazy fog of wondering how a root became a legend, and why people kept chasing it across centuries. Your fingers curl against the imagined soil again, and you press on. Because the Mandrake story doesn't end with collectors and alchemists hoarding roots in little boxes lined with velvet. Oh no, this plant had a much busier resume. You follow its trail to monasteries now. Quiet stone cloisters with candlelight flickering against worn walls, where monks in robes scribble recipes not just for soul care, but for salves, tinctures, and potions. In those ancient apothecaries, the mandrake found its place beside herbs like wormwood and valerian root, less flashy, perhaps, but still powerful in their own right. Here, the mandrake was treated with a peculiar reverence. Not feared exactly, but handled the way you'd approach a sleeping tiger. Useful, but don't make it mad. It was used for sleep, primarily, for pain, for fevers, for calming someone enough to do the medieval equivalent of dental surgery, which usually involved forceps, chanting, and an alarming amount of faith. Mainstream historical records confirm that mandrake was one of the earliest known plants used in pre-modern anesthetic recipes. Long before chloroform or nitrous oxide, a poultice of mandrake might help you forget that a monk just sawed through your leg with a rusty blade. Comforting, right? But then the Renaissance hit. And with it came a new, obsessive interest in organizing knowledge. Herbals, those gloriously illustrated medical encyclopedias, became all the rage. Some were almost luxurious, with gilded borders and dramatic drawings of, yes, mandrake roots posed like Renaissance nudes. Curved, confident, and still screaming, according to the captions. One widely circulated herbal included a full-page engraving of a mandrake being dug up, complete with a dog and a man plugging his ears. Another showed a mandrake being harvested by moonlight under the guidance of the planet Mercury, which was apparently in charge of both communication and complicated vegetables. Historians still argue whether these images were meant as genuine instruction manuals or symbolic representations of deeper spiritual truths. Were they practical guides? Or more like medieval fan fiction for bored physicians? No one knows for sure. Meanwhile, folklore kept evolving. In Germanic traditions, mandrakes began appearing in tales of witches, particularly those who flew through the night carrying charms made of bone, belladonna, and, you guessed it, mandrake. One rumor claimed witches would anoint their brooms with mandrake-infused ointment to help them fly through dreamscapes. No TSA clearance required. In England, things got even weirder. People started giving their mandrakes clothes. Full-on tiny outfits. Tunics, little hats, sometimes even boots. Dressed-up roots. Imagine explaining that to a guest. Oh, that's just my mandrake. He likes wool. Keeps the evil spirits out. The belief was that if you treated your mandrake like a person, fed it, washed it, clothed it, it would protect you. Some accounts describe owners speaking softly to their mandrake, as if it might get offended and stop working. Or worse, retaliate. You might laugh, but look around your room. See that favorite stuffed animal, the mug you always use, the lucky sock hidden in your drawer? We're not so different from those superstitious herbalists. We still assign meaning to objects, still whisper hope into things that cannot speak back. Fringe tidbit for you. In some parts of Eastern Europe, it was believed a mandrake could act as a spiritual surrogate. If you died suddenly or violently, your mandrake might carry a piece of your soul, keeping it safe until Judgment Day. Like root-based cloud storage for your afterlife credentials. But by the Enlightenment, the botanical glamour began to fade. Scientists with powdered wigs and very serious eyebrows started categorizing plants with Latin names and no patience for drama. The mandrake became Mandragora officinarum, stuffed in specimen drawers and labeled with little tags. It still had a place in pharmacopoeias, but it wasn't mysterious anymore. It was just one ingredient among many, powerful, sure, but stripped of its mythic costume. Like a rock star asked to play background music in an elevator. Still, the echoes of its strange past refused to vanish entirely. Romantic poets in the 18th and 19th centuries fell back in love with it. They adored the drama, the idea of a root that cried when touched, that could seduce, destroy, or save depending on how you brewed it. Writers used the mandrake as a metaphor for buried pain, for the seductive allure of danger, or for madness bubbling just beneath the surface of daily life. And yes, people still tried to grow them. Gardeners experimented with mandrake seeds, though they're notoriously difficult to germinate. Even modern plant hobbyists talk about them in hushed tones on forums and YouTube channels. Treat it gently, they say. Don't overwater. And don't expect it to like you. Because despite everything, centuries of superstition, medicine, art, and flat-out nonsense, the mandrake still refuses to be fully understood. It's not the most useful plant in the modern pharmacological lineup. It's toxic in the wrong dose. It's fussy about soil. It's unpredictable, awkward, a little too much. And yet, here we are, still whispering about it at bedtime like it's a secret worth keeping. You blink slowly, imagining one now, a root on your windowsill, arms curled, legs crossed, maybe wearing a jaunty hat. A tiny, ancient roommate with an attitude. Would it scream if you touched it? Would it glow in the dark? Would it sigh and roll its leafy eyes at your messy kitchen? Probably. And you'd love it anyway. Because the mandrake isn't just a plant. It's a mirror of our fears, our hopes, our need to believe that somewhere out there, maybe right beneath our feet, there's still magic left in the dirt. You've been traveling through centuries, feeling the cool earth under your fingertips, hearing whispers of legends that refuse to die. Now, as you settle into this final stretch of our mandrake journey, you sense the shift, how this bizarre plant's story folds into the fabric of modern culture, quietly persisting in unexpected places. Think about it. Despite centuries of scientific progress, the mandrake root still pops up in movies, books, and even video games. It's the go-to symbol for magic, mystery, and danger wrapped in a plant-shaped package. If you've ever watched a fantasy film where a wizard pulls a screaming root from the ground or brewed a potion in a game, you've brushed up against the mandrake myth without even realizing it. This persistent echo isn't a coincidence. The mandrake's legendary scream and humanoid form make it uniquely creepy and captivating, perfect for storytellers looking to spice up their tales. But beneath the theatricality, it also represents something deeper, humanity's fascination with the unknown, our urge to find meaning in the natural world's oddities. Scientists today study Mandragora officinarum not for screams or magic, but for its chemical compounds, alkaloids that have real medicinal effects, both useful and dangerous. Modern pharmacology acknowledges its potential, though with strict caution. That's quite a leap from the days when you needed a dog and a silver knife just to safely unearth one. Historians still argue whether medieval beliefs about mandrake were purely superstitious or part of a larger system of early medical practice blending observation and myth. Was the scream a real warning or just a metaphor for the risks of harvesting a toxic plant? Were the elaborate rituals serious precautions or theatrical performances to ward off bad luck? The debate lingers. In pop culture, the mandrake often plays the role of the misunderstood outsider, the strange root with a human shape and a scream that unsettles everyone. Like an awkward cousin at a family reunion, it's both fascinating and a little terrifying. But its story also reminds us that sometimes our fears spring from what we don't understand. You might smile thinking about how the mandrake's tale perfectly encapsulates the weird intersection of nature, superstition, and science. It's a reminder that even the boring parts of history, like medieval herbal lore, can carry wild, vivid stories waiting to be uncovered. So, as you slowly drift off now, remember, the mandrake is still out there in the shadows of history and imagination. A root with a scream, a story with many voices, and a secret waiting to be heard. Now, let your breath soften, slow, and deepen as the mandrake's tale fades gently into the night. Imagine the roots resting quietly beneath the soil, no longer screaming, just sleeping beneath a blanket of earth and time. The stories you've heard are whispers carried on the wind, echoes from a distant past where magic and reality danced in uneasy balance. The world keeps turning, the plants keep growing, and those old legends settle softly into dreams. Feel the calm spread across your body as your mind drifts with the hum of the night, soft, steady, and soothing. You are safe, warm, and connected to all the curious minds who have ever looked at a strange root and wondered about its secrets. Let the mandrake's quiet presence lull you into rest, where imagination blooms like wildflowers in a moonlit meadow. Sleep now, and when you wake, carry a little piece of that ancient magic with you. Sweet dreams.